the devastating consequences, right? Like this was a toxic environment at the highest level where you have examples of athletes leaving sport, athlete quitting sports that they had spent their entire life participating in.
All right, today's video is aimed at sports administrators. If you run a team, an organization, a nonprofit that deals with youth sports, you need to have policies in place that help protect your athletes from abuse. So in today's video, I'm bringing on Bobby Click, who's an attorney with EMFIG, Employment Matters, the Flynn Investigations Group, and he's the executive director of sports safety with their law firm, and he presents workshops all over the country, helping organizations put down policies and get everything in line so that they can have good codes of conduct, all sorts of things to keep their athletes safe from sexual abuse. So in this video, he's going to share some of his top tips for organizations, things that you can start to implement as far as new codes of conduct, policies, updates, communication between parents, coaches, and athletes, all this good stuff that's going to help you iron out new and improved policies to protect your athletes. So if you're wondering, this is a departure from my normal baseball, softball, mental skills content. What I'm trying to do here on my channel is to address all sorts of issues in youth sports. And I think this is a super important topic because the more organizations can have great policies to spot potential abuse, then it can be prevented so that kids have a safe, healthy sports environment. If nothing else, I care about kids having a great experience, and that involves them being safe. So without further ado, let's jump to our conversation with Bobby Click, attorney, executive director of sports safety with EMFIG. All right, so Bobby, what's the very first thing that a sports organization should do or implement if they're trying to create a safer sports environment for their athletes? And if you could, can you define what it means to you to have a safe sport environment?
Yeah, so that's a great part, right? To just make sure we're all here on the same page, which is a safe sport environment to me is an environment that does everything it can to mitigate risk of physical, emotional, or sexual abuse and support those athletes to ensure that they can be successful, right? Making sure that they're out there, they're enjoying, they're succeeding, they are improving, but they're not being subjected to sexual abuse, physical or abuse or emotional abuse. That's what a safe environment is to me for athletes. When I talk about the first thing you've got to do, right? Education is so important to me because it sets up response, recognition, prevention. It is implementing mandatory abuse prevention for all coaches, staffs, and volunteers, right? That's going to focus on things like recognizing grooming behaviors, understanding what their reporting obligations are, fostering a safe environment for athletes, right? Like really educating those adults who are heavily involved to create a proactive, positive culture for athletes, right? But I think I would also recommend organizations to go a step further and extend abuse prevention education opportunities to parents or athletes, right? I think it has to be mandatory for coaches, for staffs, for volunteers, but I also think it is equally important for them to offer opportunities to the parents and the athletes so that they, whether it's recognizing grooming signs, boundary blurring, empowering them to communicate openly with their children. There's so many different things that they can, right? For athletes, give them some age-appropriate training that can teach them about safe interactions with their coaches, how to identify red flags for either themselves or their peers, right? And when to speak up and how to speak up if something feels uncomfortable, right? So by involving all of these people, the coaches, the staff, the parents, the athletes, that's a real holistic approach that ensures everyone is equipped to play an active role in preventing abuse and creating those safe environments we were talking about.
Yeah, I think that's super important. And for me, as a former baseball academy owner, we had our travel teams and we had our coaches and we had our parent meetings. And looking back, we didn't have a policy and we didn't have mandatory training for this. And it's definitely something where I think, and that's the reason we're making this video, is everyone should just continue to try to do better, right? And a lot of us in my world, we just don't necessarily know all the full checklist of what we should be educating our coaches, parents, and players about. So I think that's a great point. So what's your next action step? So after you have some mandatory training, what's the next thing you'd want to implement in your own organization, for example?
I want to see an organization spending time developing a really thorough and robust code of conduct, right? I've seen too many organizations in my line of work that have a one-page code of conduct that doesn't really define what is acceptable or unacceptable behaviors with regards to interactions with athletes, with regards to what is physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, right? I think that's another just such an important step. These policies, they need to be very clear. They need to leave no room for vagueness or ambiguity. They need to have policies around things like communications, transportation, physical contact, and ensure that every single staff member, whether that's a coach, a volunteer, an admin, understands that code, understands it is non-negotiable, meaning there is 100% accountability if you violate any portion of this code. And that is just non-negotiable, period, right? And I would always suggest, like, with that understanding comes a little bit of training, right? Make sure that you're not just having them sign it. You're giving them resources, you're having classes, you're having sessions, whatever it is, to make sure that they truly understand what the code is, what the purpose of the code is, and that it is non-negotiable, that being involved with that organization comes with the responsibility to abide by that code of conduct. There's a lot of samples, a lot of resources online that you can look at that will help you there, because I really do think creating a robust code that is consistently and actively enforced goes a long way in creating a safe environment in sport.
And so some of those examples of things you're talking about, like, conduct policy for communication. So we can, as a group, use, WhatsApp group chats for our teams, but you cannot communicate with your athletes via Snapchat or Instagram DM or, so and so. And here's when you can give a player a ride home solo, or here's when you can't, or here's when you need to ask permission. So say a kid his parent forgets to pick him up at the field and they're the last kid there, and you're not going to leave them. What's the policy can you get that kid a ride home? Do you have to call someone to get approval first? Like, those are some of the examples, I think, where, like you said, they need to be really ironclad and ironed out, and players and parents and coaches know what's expected and what are the channels that we're going to use to make sure everything is on the up and up.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because these are things that are happening every day in sport, right? Your coaches are communicating with your athletes. So having a policy that says you're going to use our official channels of communication, and that official channel has to include another adult, right? Like you said, if you're going to transport an athlete, have another athlete or another adult in the car. If there can't be, get consent from the parent, right? Remove any ambiguity in situations that are occurring in sport every day, that are going to continue to occur in sport every day, because they're necessary parts. We can do them safer.
So let's talk about reporting. So obviously a lot of people are sometimes afraid to report. They don't think they'll be believed. We've talked about grooming behavior and how many of these coaches are super charming and well-liked and a part of the community. And, if someone feels like, hey, I don't want to report them, everyone likes them, they're going to hate me if I report them. What do you advise organizations to do as far as reporting?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize, right? If abuse has happened or is happening, if people don't have a way they are comfortable with reporting, there's a good chance the organization never finds out about it. If you don't find out about it, you can't take action, right? So I tell people, my suggestions are always to, if you can, create multiple opportunities for reporting, whether that's an online form, whether that's a phone call, so you have a hotline or a phone number, you have an email address that's designated for this. I also like the option to report anonymously, meaning that a person can come forward and make a report without having to reveal identifying information. I think that's very important because of exactly what you said, which is there are sometimes they are afraid to make a report from fear of retaliation. What's going to happen to me if they found out I reported? Maybe that coach has the ability to affect their playing time, right? There's so many ways that can do that. So for me, at least, it's you really want multiple forms of reporting. I would also suggest designating a person that, is responsible for safeguarding in the organization to receive those complaints. That is going to not only, hopefully, meet people where they're at to encourage them to report. And if they can do it anonymously without fear of retaliation, it's also going to build trust with the community, right? If the community sees that your organization has taken the steps to build out designated reporting options, right? That you've put in the time and the effort to think about how someone's going to report. It goes a long way, right? To trust, and to me, ensures things are addressed swiftly and effectively. I've worked with organizations recently where the only way you can make a report is walking up to a desk and doing that report in person. That was not effective, right? They were shocked that when they built out a hotline in an online form, their reports went up, right? And I was telling this not because the abuse has increased, It's because people now feel like they have a reporting avenue that's safer, that feels better, that they feel more comfortable with. And that's what happens. So take some time as an organization and think about how you can give your stakeholders, whether that's athletes, parents, other coaches, staff, whoever may see something, a safe way to report, right? And if you can, give them multiple options and designate a point person.
So you've talked about in your, I attended one of your in-person workshops. You talked about peer monitoring and other systems. So what are some of the other systems, including peer monitoring, that can help prevent abuse within sports organizations?
Yeah, so I love peer monitoring systems. And when I say like a peer monitoring system, I'm talking about either empowering athletes to come forward if they see another athlete engaging in misconduct, or putting a responsibility on adult staffers, coaches, volunteers, that if they observe something, they have a requirement to report, right? And so for me, at least, these are the individuals that spend the most time with each other, and we want them empowered and taking an active role in maintaining a safe environment, right? And we do that by these peer monitoring systems where we say, hey, you as an athlete, if you see bullying or you see hazing of one of your teammates, say something, right? Report it here. You can help stop it. If it's a coach or adult saying like, you have a responsibility to do this, right? We want everybody involved. Safety is not just the responsibility of a designated safe sport person, right? They may be the designated person, but if we truly want to be impactful in a sports environment, we want everybody empowered and involved to take action if they see something, right? And that plays exactly what we were talking about, doing the training, having the reporting requirements, right? Having the, options available for an honors. All of these things play together to create this really effective peer monitoring system. And I can tell you, I have seen it work. So, look for ways that you can involve all of your stakeholders in making your environment safer.
That's great. That's really good advice. Last one, give me one more action step, one of your biggest recommendations for a sports organization who's, maybe just starting out and wants to get better at their organizational policies.
I tell people that one of the things you need to set up in the beginning is a review mechanism, right? Especially if you're just starting out, you're going to have to review, you're going to have to update, you're going to have to adapt your policies, right? Think about that. Predators, abusers, they change, they adapt. They learn your rules and they move around them. Your safeguards have to do the same thing, right? You have to look at ways you can always improve. Every small step forward is going to make your environment safer. So whether that's engaging experts, conducting internal organizational policy reviews, doing what I can call like a community review where you're bringing the community together to look at your policies, see what is effective, what isn't effective, what's working, what's not. Take a look at your policies. It is okay if your policies need to change, right? Understand that being able to adapt and update those policies is a necessity in this world, right? I saw policies that are 10 or 15 year old. Think about how fast things change in our environment. Your policies, your procedures, how you handle things, they have to adapt to. So I don't like it when people determine we need to adapt or change our policies because something's happened. Be a little bit more proactive. Set a calendar, set a schedule that says every 6 months, every year, every 2 years, we're going to review. We're going to change if necessary. We're going to adapt. Get that policy set so that you're being proactive in it, so that you're not waiting until something happens to say, hey, this policy was a little too loose and this allowed this to happen, so we're going to tighten it up now. You absolutely have to do that as well. But again, be a little proactive with it. Move into a situation where you are proactively engaging with your stakeholders, reviewing and updating those policies to make sure you have up-to-date best practices in place.
Yeah, and that's especially important with just how fast technology changes. Like we talked about communication channels, right? Suddenly, TikTok's an example, just burst on the scene, a couple years ago, where now we have a policy on can you communicate with athletes via TikTok or all these different things, right? So keeping up with technology and again, just doing continuing education and figuring out where are those holes we can patch before they become a problem. That's super important. So Bobby, can you send us out with a story that just kind of illustrates a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about and some of the ways policies either break down or, how they can be used to affect positive change?
Yeah, I think a story that's really illustrative of this is been in the news recently is with USA Biathlon, right? So we were talking about the highest level of athletes that compete at the Olympics. And recently, an Olympian came forward and exposed decades of abuse, female athletes, and they were reporting abuse from experiencing sexual harassment from coaches, from officials, and their complaints were often ignored or dismissed in favor of pursuing medals. What you heard of like podiums over people, and this neglect, this ignoring created a toxic environment where misconduct thrived, right? Abuse thrived. And recently, some really courageous athletes, such as like Joanne Reed, who's an Olympian, came forward and started to shine the light on the extent of the abuse. And it was finally acknowledged, right? And so you have all of this abuse occurring for decades at the highest level. And in response, this is what I think is important, right? You have to address the abuse, but you also had to figure out a way to prevent it in the future. So USA Biathlon, that's what they do, right? So they've initiated all workshops and measures, new policies, new procedures, all aimed at addressing gaps in past grievances with transparency and trying to, improve athlete safety, right? So this thing, it underscores to me a couple things, like the devastating consequences, right? Like this was a toxic environment at the highest level where you have examples of athletes leaving sport, athlete quitting sports that they had spent their entire life participating in, right? But it also highlights positive changes that can occur when these measures are put in place, right? It's never too late, right? And some of the conversations these athletes are having now are saying that they're seeing these improvements happening in biathlon. And this is new, right? This is ongoing. It's going to change. But think about that, right? Think about how for 20 years this abuse happened because people weren't looking at their policies and procedures. They weren't adapting their policies and procedures. They weren't following their policies and procedures, right? They didn't have that safe reporting environment. All of those things we were talking about to set up a safe environment for athletes. Don't wait until an athlete comes forward and talks about there's been 5, 10, 20 years of abuse at this facility. Be proactive. Do the things we're talking about. If you do learn of abuse, right? If something has happened, right? Because there's a lot of abuse out there. Take that opportunity to move your organization forward, right? By creating, new policies, new procedures that not only address the grievances, but really fill the gaps and improve the safety in the environment. We see that happening even at the highest levels in 2024 in the U.S. Olympic communities, right? It needs to happen everywhere.
Yeah, really important message. So, Bobby, thanks so much for being here. Can you give us a little bit about what you do? Because I know you travel around, you do workshops, you also do investigations. But if someone wants to get in touch with you and start to do better for their organization, fill us in a little bit about how you can help.
Yeah, so I work with an organization called Sports Safety, and we work with sports organizations and youth-serving organizations around the country in preventing and addressing abuse, right? So what we do is we help organizations develop policies, procedures. We help educate them through our educational programs on what is abuse, what are safe coaching practices, how to respond to abuse if it occurs. And then we also help them investigate and respond if an allegation is made, which I think it's really important to handle both of those things. Really important. The preventative piece has to be handled. The response piece has to be handled appropriately as well. I think every youth, every adult, anybody participating in sport deserves to participate in a safe, supportive environment. And that's what our organization is here to do. We work with organizations to make sure that they're as safe as possible and that they address abuse in an appropriate best practices right now.
So if you're watching at home, you'll be able to find links where you can get in touch with Bobby Click and his organization. And remember, this is super important stuff. Everyone wants kids to have a safe, exciting, fun sports career, and having these policies in place is super important. And again, don't be embarrassed if you haven't had these in place. I just revealed that when I had my academy, we didn't. And sometimes you just don't know. And the important thing is that you start today, right? That you just get started and move forward. So thanks again to Bobby Click for being here. And again, you'll find links in the description below if you want to follow up with him.